Welcome to Void of Fears, where the line between reality and nightmares blur with every tale. What you're about to hear has happened to someone, somewhere, perhaps even someone just like you. Our community continues to grow, and now we're reaching for 100,000 subscribers. If these glimpses into the unknown call to you, please consider subscribing. Now let's dive into tonight's story. The city lights flickered and died in perfect synchronization, block by block, like dominoes falling in the darkness. Jake Thompson pressed his trembling hands against the window of his apartment, watching as every electronic billboard, street lamp, and car alarm activated simultaneously across the sprawling metropolis below. His phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Shelter in place, do not look up. But Jake couldn't help himself. Through the glass, he saw it, a massive shadow moving across the face of the moon, blotting out stars as it passed. The silhouette was geometric, crystalline, impossibly vast. His voice cracked as he whispered into his phone's voice recorder, "My name is Jake Thompson. If you're hearing this, then they've already taken me. This is how it all started." 6 weeks earlier, Thursday night. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Jake barely noticed. It was 11:23 p.m. at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, and he was pulling in another late shift monitoring Hubble's deep space feeds. The building was nearly empty, except for a skeleton crew of security guards and the occasional janitor pushing a cart down the echoing hallways. Jake had been working at NASA for 8 years, ever since graduating from MIT with his doctorate in astrophysics. Most nights were routine. Distant galaxies spinning slowly through the void, stellar formations billions of years old, the occasional comet drifting through space like a dirty snowball. He'd grown accustomed to the solitude, finding peace in the vast emptiness of space displayed on his monitors. Tonight felt different, though he couldn't pinpoint why. The air in the control room seemed thicker somehow, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. An electronic humming filled the space, barely audible but persistent, like the buzz of old fluorescent lights, but deeper, more resonant. Jake glanced around the room, checking his equipment. Banks of computers lined the walls, their screens casting blue light across his face. The Hubble Space Telescope's main feed dominated the center monitor, showing a section of space near the Kuiper Belt. Everything appeared normal, but the humming continued, and within that sound, Jake could swear he heard something that resembled whispered voices, carried on radio static. He adjusted his headphones and focused on the telescope's incoming data stream. That's when the sensors detected it. At first, Jake thought it was a malfunction. The object appeared at the very edge of our solar system, roughly 42 astronomical units from the sun. The readings were off the charts, something massive beyond anything in recorded space observation history. Jake's fingers flew across his keyboard, adjusting the telescope's focus and running diagnostic checks on his equipment. This couldn't be right. The object was larger than Earth's moon, but it wasn't showing the gravitational signatures of a planetary body. As the image sharpened, his excitement turned to confusion, then to a creeping sense of dread that started in his stomach and spread through his chest like ice water. The structure was perfectly geometric, composed of what appeared to be crystalline formations that reflected starlight in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The surface was covered in intricate designs that resembled circuit boards, more than natural formations. Rotating segments moved in precise, synchronized patterns, and the entire construct was oriented directly toward Earth, as if it had been positioned there specifically to observe our planet. Jake's equipment began malfunctioning as he tried to capture clearer images. The temperature in the control room plummeted 15 degrees in minutes, his breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Frost began forming on the inside of the windows, and the humming sound grew louder, more insistent. Static filled his headphones, and within that static, he could definitely hear voices now. Not human voices, but something else entirely. They spoke in harmonics that hurt to listen to, frequencies that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his skull. Jake pulled off his headphones with shaking hands and stared at the image on his screen. Enhanced imaging revealed that the structure's surface was covered in symbols, intricate, flowing designs that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. But what made his blood run cold was the discovery that this thing was actively transmitting. A steady signal beamed directly toward Earth, powerful enough to be detected across interstellar distances. The transmission was complex, layered with multiple data streams that his equipment could barely begin to decode. But even the preliminary analysis showed patterns that were undeniably intelligent in origin. Jake should have immediately contacted his supervisor, Dr. Lisa Grant. Standard protocol demanded it. Any unusual deep space phenomena required immediate notification of the department head. But something compelled him to investigate further, a nagging curiosity that overrode his training and common sense. Working through the night, Jake managed to decode fragments of the signal. What he found defied explanation. The transmission contained embedded data streams showing star charts with our solar system mapped in perfect detail, including the positions of planets, major asteroids, and even some of Earth's artificial satellites. But more disturbing were the detailed scans of Earth's surface, high-resolution images of major cities, population density maps, atmospheric composition readings, and biological surveys that included human DNA structures. According to the timestamps embedded in the data, these scans had been taken regularly for decades. The Watchers, whatever they were, had been studying Earth for longer than Jake had been alive. As dawn broke over the Maryland countryside, Jake finally leaned back in his chair, his eyes burning from staring at screens all night. The implications of what he'd discovered were staggering. This wasn't just first contact. This was evidence of a long-term surveillance operation targeting Earth and its inhabitants. He thought about calling Dr. Grant, but something held him back. If this information fell into the wrong hands, it could cause worldwide panic. Jake decided to spend the weekend analyzing the data further before making any official reports. The weekend investigation. Jake spent Saturday and Sunday holed up in his apartment, surrounded by printouts and backup drives containing the alien data. His small home office, normally organized and tidy, became a chaos of papers, empty coffee cups, and computer equipment running continuously. The more he analyzed the signal, the more disturbing it became. The aliens weren't just observing Earth, they were conducting what appeared to be a comprehensive biological survey of the human species. The data included detailed anatomical diagrams, genetic sequences, brain scans, and even psychological profiles of different human personality types. Jake discovered that the transmission wasn't limited to a single frequency. The aliens were broadcasting on multiple bands simultaneously, creating a complex web of data streams that painted a complete picture of Earth's biosphere. They had catalogued every major species, mapped migration patterns, analysed the chemical composition of the oceans, and even tracked climate change over the past century. But the human data was the most extensive. The aliens possessed information about human biology that surpassed anything in Earth's medical databases. They knew about genetic variations between different ethnic groups, understood the function of so-called junk DNA that human scientists were still puzzling over, and had mapped neural pathways in the human brain with unprecedented precision. Most disturbing of all, Jake found evidence that the aliens had been present at key moments in human history. Radio telescopes from around the world had detected similar signals during major technological breakthroughs, the invention of the transistor, the development of integrated circuits, the creation of the internet. Each time humanity made a significant technological leap, the alien signals had intensified. It was as if they were monitoring human progress, waiting for something. Sunday evening, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He encrypted copies of all the data and uploaded them to a secure server he'd set up years ago for backing up his personal research. If something happened to him, he wanted evidence of the discovery to survive. Monday morning, the confrontation. Jake arrived at work to find his access codes changed and his desk cleared out. His heart sank as he stood in the doorway of his office, looking at the empty space where his computer and research materials had been just 3 days earlier. 2 security guards appeared behind him. "Dr. Thompson, you need to come with us." They escorted him through corridors he'd never seen before, using keycards to access elevators that didn't appear on any building directory. The descent seemed to last forever, taking them deep underground where the walls were lined with sound-dampening material, and the air tasted of recycled oxygen and industrial disinfectant. The sub-level facility was massive, filled with monitoring equipment and workstations, where technicians in white coats analysed data streams Jake didn't recognise. He caught glimpses of images on their screens, satellite photos, radio telescope data, and what looked suspiciously like the same alien symbols he'd discovered over the weekend. Director Robert Hall was waiting in a sterile conference room along with Dr. Susan Clark, a severe-looking woman Jake had never seen before. Hall was in his 60s with grey hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades keeping government secrets. Clark appeared younger, maybe mid-40s, but her eyes held a hardness that suggested she'd seen things that aged her beyond her years. Between them sat a thick file marked Project Watcher in red letters. "Dr. Thompson," Hall began, his voice carefully measured and devoid of emotion. "Please sit down. We need to discuss your recent discovery." Jake remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides. "My discovery? You mean the alien structure that's been broadcasting toward Earth for decades while NASA apparently ignored it?" Dr. Clark opened the file, revealing photographs of the same crystalline structure Jake had found. The images were clearer than anything his equipment had captured, taken from multiple angles and showing details that should have been impossible to photograph from Earth. "This object appeared exactly 2 years ago," Clark said. "You're the 5th NASA employee to discover it independently." Jake felt the world tilt slightly. "The 5th? Where are the others?" Hall and Clark exchanged glances before Hall spoke. "Dr. Kevin Ross is currently institutionalized at a secure facility in Virginia. After 3 weeks of studying the structure, he began claiming that alien voices were speaking directly into his mind. He started drawing symbols on every available surface, symbols that matched the ones found on the alien construct. He became violent when anyone tried to stop him." Clark continued the grim roll call. "Dr. Jennifer Adams was found dead in her car at the bottom of Chesapeake Bay 6 months ago. According to her final phone call to her sister, she was driving to meet the Watchers. She claimed they were calling to her, promising to take her away from Earth." "Dr. Mark Wilson vanished entirely," Hall added. Security footage shows him leaving the facility at 2 a.m. with several hard drives of classified data. His car was found abandoned at Dulles Airport, but there's no record of him boarding any flight. His last log entry stated that he was going to meet them in person. Jake's legs felt weak. He sank into the offered chair. "And the 4th? "Dr. Eric Moore lasted the longest," Clark said quietly. 3 months of intensive research before he suffered a complete psychotic break. He's been in a psychiatric facility for 8 months now, completely catatonic. He just stares at the ceiling and draws geometric patterns on any surface he can reach. The patterns match the alien symbols perfectly, but he's never been conscious enough to explain how he knows them." The room fell silent except for the hum of ventilation systems. Jake struggled to process what he was hearing. "You're telling me that everyone who discovers this thing either dies, disappears, or goes insane?" "The structure isn't just passively observing," Hall said. "It's been gradually adjusting Earth's electromagnetic field through its transmissions. Our satellite data shows subtle changes in atmospheric composition, increased tectonic activity, along specific fault lines and mass animal migrations following patterns that mirror the structure's signal pulses. Clark leaned forward. "Dr. Thompson, we're offering you a choice. You can accept memory modification and reassignment to a comfortable position studying weather patterns, or you can continue your research under our supervision, knowing the risks involved." "What kind of risks?" "The same ones that affected your predecessors. Extended exposure to the alien signal appears to have neurological effects. The symbols you've been studying aren't just decorative. They seem to function as some kind of carrier wave that affects human brain chemistry." Jake thought about the voices he'd heard in the static, the geometric patterns that had started appearing in his peripheral vision. "And if I refuse both options?" The pause was telling. Hall's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Dr. Moore and Dr. Adams refused both options as well. Despite the implied threat, Jake found himself unable to let go of what he'd discovered. That night, he returned to his apartment with a mind racing with questions and possibilities. The official story didn't add up. If the alien structure was so dangerous, why wasn't NASA doing more to study it? Why the secrecy instead of worldwide cooperation? Using equipment he'd borrowed from the office over the months, officially for personal projects, Jake set up a makeshift monitoring station in his apartment. He'd hidden backup drives containing the alien data in several locations, including his car and a safety deposit box downtown. The deepening obsession. Over the following weeks, Jake's investigation consumed his life. He stopped showing up for his reassigned position, monitoring weather satellites, claiming sick leave while he worked 18-hour days decoding alien transmissions from his apartment. What he found made the official NASA briefing seem like a children's story in comparison. The signals contained detailed biological information about human physiology that went far beyond what any Earth-based science had achieved. Complete genetic maps, brain chemistry analyses, and physiological studies that included information about human development, from conception to death. The aliens possessed medical knowledge that could cure diseases humanity hadn't even discovered yet. But they weren't sharing this knowledge. They were collecting it. Jake found evidence of systematic data collection going back over a century. Radio signals from the early 1900s contained alien responses to humanity's first broadcast transmissions. As human technology advanced, the alien surveillance had intensified, with monitoring stations apparently positioned throughout the solar system. The breakthrough came when Jake discovered that the alien signals weren't random collections of data, they were reports, status updates sent to somewhere deeper in space, chronicling humanity's development with the clinical detachment of scientists studying laboratory specimens. The reports included population counts, technological assessments, genetic diversity measurements, and projections for future human development. But most chilling were the behavioral studies. The aliens had been analyzing human psychology, mapping social structures, documenting warfare patterns, and tracking the spread of human civilization across the globe. Jake realized that humanity wasn't just being observed, it was being evaluated. As his obsession deepened, Jake began experiencing the same symptoms that had affected his predecessors. Geometric patterns appeared in his peripheral vision, faint at first but growing more pronounced each day. The patterns weren't random. They matched the symbols he'd found on the alien structure, as if his brain was being programmed to recognize their significance. He felt constantly watched, even in his own apartment. Electronics began malfunctioning in his presence, his television displaying fragments of alien symbols between channels, his radio picking up the same static-filled whispers he'd first heard at the observatory. His computer screen sometimes flickered with images that weren't from any file he'd accessed. Sleep became elusive. When Jake did manage to drift off, his dreams were filled with vast alien cities constructed from the same crystalline material as the space structure. In these dreams, he walked through corridors filled with other humans, all moving with the same peaceful, purposeful gait towards destinations he couldn't identify. His reflection in mirrors occasionally showed additional shadows standing behind him, tall and indistinct figures that vanished when he turned around. The shadows seemed familiar somehow, as if he'd encountered them before, in dreams he couldn't quite remember. Jake's research revealed that the structure's signals corresponded with specific dates throughout human history, moments of significant technological advancement that had accelerated human development. The first radio broadcast in 1901, the invention of television, the launch of Sputnik, the development of personal computers, the creation of the internet, the proliferation of social media. Every major leap forward in human civilization had been accompanied by intensified alien surveillance. But it was worse than simple observation. Jake found evidence that humanity's technological development had been subtly guided. Patent applications that appeared simultaneously in different countries by inventors who'd never met. Scientific breakthroughs that occurred to multiple researchers at exactly the same time. Innovations that seemed to come from nowhere but built perfectly on existing technology. The Watchers hadn't just been passive observers, they'd been shepherding human civilization towards some predetermined goal, nudging human development along specific pathways, while documenting every step of the process. The psychological breakdown. 3 weeks into his intensive research, Jake's mental state began deteriorating rapidly. The geometric patterns in his vision became more frequent and complex, sometimes overlaying his entire field of view, with alien symbols that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. He started hearing voices during his waking hours. Not the static-filled whispers from the radio, but clear, harmonious tones that seemed to emanate from inside his skull. The voices spoke in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood, urging him to continue his research, to dig deeper into the alien data. Jake's apartment became a maze of papers, printouts, and hand-drawn diagrams covering every available surface. He'd stopped eating regular meals, surviving on coffee and whatever food he could grab without leaving his computer. His appearance deteriorated, unshaven, hollow-eyed, his clothes wrinkled from sleeping at his desk. The voices grew stronger, more insistent. They spoke of humanity's purpose, of a grand design that stretched across millennia. They explained that human civilization wasn't an accident, but a carefully cultivated experiment, guided by intelligence far beyond anything Earth had produced. During one particularly intense session, Jake discovered hidden layers in the alien transmission, data streams that required specific decryption keys to access. When he finally cracked the encryption, what he found shattered his remaining sanity. The hidden data contained detailed plans for Earth's future, population management protocols, genetic modification schedules, technological development timelines, and something called harvest protocols that made Jake's blood run cold. Humanity wasn't being studied for scientific curiosity, it was being prepared for collection. The documents outlined a process that had been repeated countless times throughout the galaxy. Promising species were identified, monitored, and gradually developed until they reached optimal parameters for what the aliens called integration. Then they were harvested, their useful individuals taken for purposes Jake couldn't begin to comprehend. According to the timeline, Earth's harvest was scheduled to begin within months. Wednesday night, the response. Jake was hunched over his computer at 3 a.m., his eyes red from staring at screens and his hands shaking from too much caffeine, when his makeshift monitoring equipment detected something that changed everything. An incoming transmission from deep space, not from the structure at the edge of our solar system, but from much farther away. The signal was massive, powerful enough to reach Earth across interstellar distances with perfect clarity, a response signal. Jake's hands trembled as he worked to decode the message, his jerry-rigged equipment struggling to process the enormous data stream. What he found made him physically sick. The transmission contained precise coordinates for every major population center on Earth. New York, London, Tokyo, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, Cairo, Mexico City, Lagos. Hundreds of cities, each marked with detailed population counts, infrastructure assessments, and something labelled as collection quotas. But that wasn't the worst part. The message included arrival times. Something massive was approaching our solar system, using the crystalline structure as a navigation beacon and communication relay. According to the transmission, a fleet of harvest ships had been travelling toward Earth for over 2 years, following the signals sent by the monitoring station at the edge of our solar system. Jake tried calling Dr. Grant, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He tried Director Hall, same result. When he attempted to access NASA's internal network, he found that his credentials had been completely revoked, and any attempt to log in triggered security alerts. The next morning, Jake's world became a paranoid nightmare. Black SUVs appeared outside his apartment building, parking across the street with tinted windows that reflected the morning sun, like dead eyes. His internet access was restricted to basic websites. His phone calls were clearly monitored, and his email account had been suspended for suspicious activity. When he tried to contact Tom Bradley, a journalist friend who'd helped him fact-check research papers in the past, the call was disconnected mid-sentence. An hour later, Tom's phone number had been disconnected entirely. Jake realised he was completely isolated, cut off from any means of warning the world about what was coming. Director Hall called him that afternoon, his voice carrying a tone of false sympathy that made Jake's skin crawl. "Jake, you need to come in. We've been monitoring your research, and we're concerned about your mental state. We have a solution for you. A simple procedure that will help you forget about all this unpleasantness. Memory modification, completely painless, and then a nice, quiet desk job studying weather satellite data. No more deep space work. No more alien structures. You can have a normal life, maybe even meet someone. Settle down." "And if I refuse?" The pause stretched long enough for Jake to hear his own heartbeat. Dr. Moore and Dr. Adams refused as well. Look how that turned out for them. The threat was clear, but Jake was beyond caring about his personal safety. That night, he used the last of his hidden equipment to make one final observation of the alien structure. What he saw destroyed any remaining hope he'd held for humanity's future. The crystalline construct at the edge of our solar system wasn't alone anymore. Massive ships, each one the size of small moons, were entering the outer reaches of our star system. They moved with impossible grace for objects so large, their surfaces reflecting starlight in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Jake counted 12 of them before his equipment overloaded and died, sparks flying from his jury-rigged monitoring devices as they succumbed to electromagnetic interference from the approaching fleet. Using his laptop and the last of his stolen NASA access codes, Jake managed to intercept one final transmission from the alien fleet. The message was brief but comprehensive, containing deployment orders for what could only be described as a harvest operation. Earth had been selected for cultivation completion. Humanity had reached the optimal level of technological development and population density. The harvest wasn't an invasion in any traditional sense. It was a scheduled collection planned and prepared for decades in advance. The timestamps on the alien communications revealed a timeline that went back centuries. The Watchers had been here before, many times conducting smaller harvests throughout human history. Ancient disappearances that historians had attributed to natural disasters, plagues or wars had actually been alien collection operations, taking small numbers of humans for purposes that remained unclear. But this time was different. This was the final harvest, the completion of a project that had been underway since the dawn of human civilization. As Jake worked frantically to document everything he'd discovered, he began noticing changes in the world around him. News reports mentioned unusual aurora activity, visible even during daylight hours, but government officials claimed it was just an unusually intense solar storm. Birds began migrating out of season, following flight paths that formed geometric patterns when viewed from satellite imagery. The ocean tides shifted slightly, following rhythms that matched the alien signal's pulse rather than the moon's gravitational pull. Jake's research revealed the most horrible truth of all. Humanity had never naturally evolved to its current state. Hidden in the genetic code of every human being were artificial modifications, subtle but unmistakable signs of outside interference, specific neural pathways that didn't exist in humanity's closest primate relatives, brain structures that seemed designed for optimal signal reception, even behavioral patterns that made humans naturally compliant to authority and resistant to questioning official narratives. The aliens hadn't just guided human technological development, they had guided human evolution itself, creating a species perfectly suited for their purposes. The surveillance intensifies. As Jake delved deeper into the genetic evidence, the surveillance around his apartment became impossible to ignore. The black SUVs were replaced by more subtle watchers, unmarked vans parked at different locations each day, men in business suits who appeared at the coffee shop where Jake occasionally bought food, phone calls where nobody spoke, but he could hear breathing on the other end. His mail stopped arriving. His landlord called to say that government agents had visited, asking questions about Jake's behaviour and requesting access to his apartment for routine inspections. When Jake went to his safety deposit box to retrieve backup drives, he found the bank branch closed for emergency repairs, with no reopening date posted. Jake realized that his isolation was complete. Every avenue of communication, every backup plan, every means of preserving or sharing his research had been systematically eliminated. He was alone with knowledge that could save humanity, but no way to act on it. The voices in his head grew stronger, more persuasive. They explained that resistance was futile, that the harvest was inevitable, and that cooperation would result in a better outcome for both Jake and the human species. They painted pictures of vast alien cities where humans lived in perfect harmony, free from disease, aging, and conflict. But Jake had seen enough of the alien data to know these were lies. The harvest wasn't about elevating humanity. It was about utilizing human biological and psychological resources for purposes that remained deliberately obscured in the alien communications. Fighting against the growing influence of the alien signals, Jake managed to decode more of the harvest protocols. What he found confirmed his worst fears about humanity's fate. Humans would be sorted into categories based on genetic markers, psychological profiles, and physical capabilities. Some would be used for manual labor in environments too dangerous for the aliens themselves. Others would serve as biological computers, their brains networked together to process complex calculations. The most psychologically adaptable would become organic components in alien technology, their consciousness merged with artificial intelligences to create hybrid systems. None of the harvest protocols mentioned humans retaining their individual identities or free will. Jake also discovered that the harvest had been practiced on other worlds throughout the galaxy. The alien communications contained references to previous operations on planets designated only by numerical codes. Each world had been monitored, developed, and eventually harvested when its dominant species reached the required parameters. Earth was just the latest in a long line of civilizations that had been cultivated for this purpose. The fleet arrives. Jake's final week of freedom was a blur of desperate research and increasing psychological pressure. The alien voices in his head became constant, offering visions of transcendence and unity, while subtly eroding his will to resist. He found himself staring at the geometric patterns on his walls for hours at a time, his mind trying to decode meanings that seemed just beyond his understanding. Using equipment salvaged from his destroyed monitoring station, Jake detected the moment when the alien fleet entered the inner solar system. The ships were even larger than his initial observations had suggested, vast constructs that seemed to bend space around themselves as they moved. As the fleet approached Earth, changes began occurring worldwide. The aurora activity intensified, visible even in broad daylight as curtains of multicolored light dancing across the sky. Electronic devices began malfunctioning in specific patterns, displaying the same geometric symbols Jake had been studying for weeks. Most disturbing of all, people began reporting shared dreams. Millions of individuals around the world dreamed of walking through crystalline corridors toward bright lights, accompanied by a sense of peace and purpose they'd never experienced before. The dreams were so vivid and consistent that news networks began reporting on the phenomenon, though government officials dismissed it as mass hysteria caused by the unusual atmospheric conditions. Jake knew better. The alien signals were already beginning to affect human brain chemistry on a global scale, preparing the population for what was to come. On his final night, Jake made one last attempt to warn the world. Using his remaining equipment, he tried to broadcast a warning message on every frequency he could access, but his transmission was blocked by interference patterns that matched the alien signal exactly. The Watchers had anticipated this move and were prepared to prevent any disruption of their operation. As Jake worked frantically at his computer, documenting everything he'd learned, in a final desperate attempt to preserve some record of the truth, he felt the alien influence growing stronger in his mind. The voices promised him a place of honor in the new order, a chance to serve purposes greater than anything human civilization had ever achieved. Part of him was tempted to give in, to accept the peace and purpose the voices offered, but Jake clung to his human identity, his defiance in the face of impossible odds, even as his grip on reality began to slip. The final night. Jake barricaded himself in his apartment as the world outside transformed around him. Every electronic device on Earth had received an activation signal simultaneously at exactly midnight, Greenwich Mean Time. Smartphones, computers, satellites, televisions, radios, even simple digital clocks began broadcasting the alien transmission in perfect synchronization. The sound was beautiful and terrible. Harmonious tones that seemed to resonate directly in human brain tissue, bypassing the ears entirely. People around the world stopped what they were doing and listened, their faces taking on expressions of wonder and peace. Through his window, Jake watched his neighbors emerging from their apartments and homes, walking calmly toward designated collection points that had appeared overnight. The collection points were impossible to miss, massive circular clearings that glowed with the same internal light as the alien structure, their surfaces covered in the geometric patterns that had haunted Jake's vision for weeks. The walkers moved with purpose but no urgency, their faces serene, almost euphoric. Children held their parents' hands, elderly couples supported each other, strangers walked side by side, as if they'd known each other for years. There was no panic, no resistance, no fear, only acceptance and a kind of transcendent joy that Jake found more terrifying than any screaming mob could have been. Jake could feel the electromagnetic pulse from the Watcher's fleet affecting his own brain chemistry. The geometric patterns on his walls seemed to pulse and move, drawing his attention deeper into their hypnotic designs. The alien voices in his head grew stronger, more insistent, offering him visions of unity and purpose that made his human existence seem small and meaningless by comparison. But Jake fought against the influence, using every technique he could remember from his psychology courses to maintain his individual identity. He focused on personal memories, his childhood dog, his first day at MIT, the excitement he'd felt when he first looked through a telescope and saw Saturn's rings. Human memories, human emotions, human experiences that the aliens couldn't replicate or replace. He pressed record on his phone one final time, his hands trembling as he spoke into the device. The harvest isn't random. We were grown for this purpose. Every war, every technological breakthrough, every population boom was carefully planned and guided. We're not being invaded. We're being collected like crops that have finally ripened. Outside, the massive alien vessels had become clearly visible in the night sky, their crystalline hulls reflecting city lights in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The ships were positioned over every major population center on Earth, their presence blotting out constellations that had guided human navigation for millennia. Beams of soft light descended from the ships' hulls, encompassing the collection points where millions of humans waited peacefully. As the light touched them, the people began to glow with the same internal luminescence as the alien technology. They looked up at the ships with expressions of gratitude and love, as if greeting beloved family members after a long separation. Jake's research scattered across his desk, like the remnants of a shattered worldview, told the complete story. Ancient stone circles like Stonehenge weren't built by primitive humans. They were the foundations of previous monitoring stations, placed by alien visitors who had been tracking human development for thousands of years. Unexplained archaeological sites around the world showed the same geometric patterns as the alien symbols, evidence of a surveillance network that had operated in secret throughout human history. Even some modern installations had been subtly modified by non-human intelligence. Satellite dishes, radio telescopes, communication arrays, all had been gradually altered to serve as components in the alien monitoring system without human operators realizing the changes. "They've been farming us for millennia," Jake whispered into his recording device, his voice barely audible over the harmonious alien signals that filled the air. "We're livestock that thinks it's free range. Every aspect of human civilization has been guided and controlled, from our genetic development to our technological progress. We were never truly free. We were just being prepared for harvest." The gentle tugging in his mind grew stronger as he spoke, the alien influence promising peace if he would only stop resisting and join the others. Through his walls, he could hear the building emptying as his neighbors opened their doors and walked calmly towards the collection points. The alien signal promised an end to suffering, to loneliness, to the constant struggle of human existence. But Jake remembered the harvest protocols he'd decoded, the clinical descriptions of how humans would be processed and utilized. The aliens weren't offering transcendence. They were offering slavery disguised as salvation. His final words were barely coherent as the alien influence overwhelmed his defenses. "If anyone finds this recording, remember, we were never alone, but we were never free either. The Watchers are patient, and they always return for their harvest. This has happened before, on other worlds, to other species. Earth is just another farm in a galaxy full of cultivated civilizations." The recording captured the sound of his apartment door splintering as the security forces arrived. Jake's terrified face was reflected in his computer screen, one last time, backlit by the glow from the collection points outside. Behind his reflection, tall, shadowy figures approached with movements that seemed to flow rather than walk. The last thing Jake saw before the alien signal finally overwhelmed his resistance was his own face transformed by the same peaceful expression he'd seen on his neighbors. Part of him welcomed the end of struggle, the promise of unity with something greater than individual human consciousness. Then the recording cut to static. The harvest completes. Across the globe, the harvest proceeded exactly as the aliens had planned for centuries. In every major city, collection points filled with willing participants who walked calmly into the beams of light, their faces showing nothing but joy and anticipation. The process was peaceful, efficient, and completely voluntary. The alien signals had prepared human minds to accept their fate without question or resistance. In remote areas where the signals couldn't reach effectively, other methods were employed. Military units around the world, their equipment mysteriously malfunctioning, found themselves unable to resist, as strange aircraft appeared overhead, but there was no violence, no conquest in any traditional sense. The aliens had learned long ago that cooperation produced better results than force. News networks tried to broadcast reports of the global phenomenon, but their equipment had been compromised weeks earlier. Every transmission was filtered through alien systems that presented the harvest as a voluntary exodus, a transcendent experience that humanity had earned through millennia of development. The few individuals who remained unaffected by the signals, people in deep underground bunkers, isolated research stations, or those with unusual brain chemistry that made them resistant to the alien influence, watched helplessly as their species was collected with the same systematic efficiency that humans use to harvest crops. By dawn, the collection was complete. Roughly 90% of Earth's human population had been taken, processed through alien technology that sorted individuals according to their genetic markers, psychological profiles, and physical capabilities. The harvest ships departed as silently as they had arrived, leaving behind a world that looked unchanged but felt utterly empty. The remaining human population, carefully selected for specific genetic traits that would ensure successful reproduction and development, emerged from their hiding places to find a world that had been reset to an earlier stage of development. Technology still functioned, but the knowledge to maintain and advance it had been taken with the harvested population. It would take generations for humanity to rebuild, to rediscover the scientific principles that had been lost with the departure of Earth's greatest minds. But the aliens were patient. They had time to wait for the next crop to mature. Official records of the harvest were systematically destroyed or altered. Within months, the few survivors who remembered the true events were dismissed as trauma victims, suffering from shared delusions brought on by the great solar storm of 2025. History books would record the disappearances as a natural disaster, a tragic but explainable event that humanity had survived through courage and resilience. The crystalline structure at the edge of the solar system pulsed once more, sending a completion signal into the depths of space where other watchers monitored other worlds at various stages of development. Then it folded in on itself, the geometric patterns collapsing into a single point of light before vanishing entirely. 50 years later, Dr. Emma Chen stood in the ruins of what had once been NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, now overgrown with vegetation and slowly being reclaimed by nature. She was part of the fourth generation born after the Great Disappearance, as historians now called it, and she carried with her the burning curiosity that had driven humanity to reach for the stars in the first place. In her weathered backpack, Emma carried a small device that would have been impossible to build. With current Earth technology, a fragment of alien equipment that had been overlooked during the harvest, found buried in the rubble of a collapsed observatory in Chile. For 3 years, she and a small group of researchers had worked to understand its function, driven by stories passed down by the survivors of 2025. The survivors had been children mostly, too young to understand what they had witnessed, but old enough to remember fragments. Stories of lights in the sky, of people walking peacefully towards something beautiful and terrible, of a silence that fell over the world like a blanket smothering a scream. Emma's grandmother had been one of those children, 8 years old, when the harvest came. She remembered her parents taking her hand and walking toward a glowing circle that appeared in the town square. But at the last moment, something had gone wrong with the alien signal in their area. The electromagnetic pulse had faltered for just a few seconds, long enough for her grandmother to break free from the influence and hide in a storm drain while her parents continued into the light without her. They looked so happy, her grandmother had said over and over until the day she died. They looked like they were going home. The alien device in Emma's backpack had finally yielded its secrets after months of careful analysis. It was a communication relay designed to monitor multiple star systems simultaneously and report back to a central command network. But more importantly, it contained a partial database of other worlds that had been harvested throughout galactic history. Earth was not unique. The pattern had been repeated thousands of times across the galaxy. Young civilizations monitored, guided, and eventually collected when they reached optimal development. Some worlds had been harvested multiple times over millennia, their populations allowed to rebuild and advance before being collected again. But Emma had discovered something else in the alien database, something that filled her with a combination of hope and terror. Not every world had submitted peacefully to harvest. Some civilizations had found ways to resist, to fight back against their watchers. Most had been destroyed for their defiance, their planets reduced to lifeless rocks floating in space. But a few had succeeded in breaking free from the harvest cycle. The database contained fragmentary records of a star system designated as Rebellion Prime, where an advanced civilization had not only resisted harvest, but had turned the tables on their watchers. They had captured alien technology, reverse engineered it, and used it to hunt down other harvest fleets throughout their region of the galaxy. Emma had spent months trying to decode the coordinates for Rebellion Prime, working with the few remaining scientists who had been too young or too isolated to be taken during the harvest. If they could make contact with this resistant civilization, perhaps Earth could avoid the fate that awaited it when the Watchers returned for the next collection. Because they would return. The database made that clear. Earth was marked for secondary harvest in approximately 200 years, when the human population had rebuilt to sufficient levels and redeveloped the technology that made them useful to their alien shepherds. Emma's research had revealed the true scope of humanity's manipulation throughout history. The survivors' stories, combined with archaeological evidence and the alien database, painted a picture of a species that had never been truly free. Every major advancement in human civilization, agriculture, writing, metallurgy, industrialization, spaceflight, had been subtly guided by alien influence. The Watchers had been patient gardeners, tending their human crop for thousands of years, occasionally pruning the population through wars, plagues, and natural disasters to prevent overgrowth that might lead to uncontrolled technological development. They had maintained the perfect balance, allowing humans to advance just fast enough to remain useful, but never fast enough to pose a threat. But the survivors of the harvest had inadvertently broken that cycle. Without the carefully controlled guidance of their alien shepherds, the remaining human population had developed in unexpected ways. Necessity had forced them to innovate rapidly, to rediscover lost technologies through trial and error rather than gradual revelation. In 50 years, the survivors had rebuilt much of Earth's infrastructure, but they had also developed new technologies that the aliens had never intended humans to possess. Quantum communication systems that couldn't be monitored by alien surveillance, weapons based on principles the Watchers had never encountered, and most importantly, a deep understanding of the alien harvest cycle that had been passed down through survivor testimonies. Emma stood in the ruined control room where Jake Thompson had made his desperate last stand half a century earlier. Her equipment had detected faint traces of the alien communication network, dormant but still present in Earth's electromagnetic field. The Watchers were still monitoring their former farm, checking periodically to ensure that the crop was developing properly. But Emma and her team had a plan. Using the alien technology they had recovered and reverse engineered, they were going to send a message into deep space, not to the Watchers, but to the rebellious civilization that had successfully fought back against the harvest cycle. If Rebellion Prime still existed, if they were still fighting the galactic farming operation, then Earth might have allies in the coming struggle. Emma activated the modified alien transmitter, sending humanity's first intentional message to the stars since the harvest. The signal contained everything they had learned about the Watchers, the harvest cycle, and the true history of human civilization. It also contained a plea for help, a request for alliance against an enemy that treated entire civilizations like crops to be grown and collected. As the transmission launched into space, Emma thought about Jake Thompson and the other researchers who had died trying to warn the world about what was coming. Their sacrifice had not been in vain. Their hidden records, their desperate attempts to preserve the truth, had survived the harvest and the decades that followed. Humanity would not be caught unprepared again. The response came 3 months later, arriving as a burst of quantum encrypted data that bypassed every alien monitoring system in the solar system. The message was brief, but filled with hope. Received your transmission. You are not alone. The harvest cycle can be broken. Prepare for contact. The Free Worlds Alliance. Emma smiled as she read the message, knowing that Jake Thompson's discovery 50 years earlier had finally borne fruit. The Watchers would return for their second harvest of Earth, but this time they would find their crop armed with knowledge, allies, and the burning determination of a species that had finally learned the truth about their place in the galaxy. The war for humanity's freedom was about to begin, and this time the outcome would be very different. The return. 150 years after the first harvest, the Watchers returned to Earth as scheduled, their massive crystalline ships emerging from the depths of space like predators, approaching a familiar feeding ground. They expected to find a world rebuilt to optimal parameters, its human population ready for secondary collection. Instead, they found empty space where Earth should have been. Humanity had not waited for the second harvest. Using technology provided by the Free Worlds Alliance and innovations born from desperate necessity, they had moved their entire civilization to a new star system, leaving behind only a message carved into the moon's surface in the aliens' own geometric script. The crop has learned to plant itself elsewhere. Try to harvest the wind. The Watchers' perfect cycle had been broken for the first time in their species' long history. Earth's former slaves had become something their ancient masters had never encountered, a free civilization capable of choosing its own destiny among the stars. Jake Thompson's final recording, preserved and transmitted across the galaxy by humanity's descendants, became a rallying cry for other enslaved worlds. His voice speaking the truth about the harvest cycle in the desperate darkness of his apartment inspired rebellions on dozens of planets. The age of the Watchers was ending, brought down by a single human scientist who had refused to accept that his species was nothing more than livestock waiting for slaughter. In the vastness of space, humanity had finally found its true purpose, not as a crop to be harvested, but as liberators fighting to free the galaxy from an ancient tyranny that had masqueraded as natural order for far too long. The signal from beyond had been answered, and the answer was defiance.